Hello, and welcome to the Gravel Ride podcast, where we go deep on the sport of gravel cycling through in-depth interviews with product designers, event organizers, and athletes who are pioneering the sport. I'm your host, Craig Dalton, a lifelong cyclist who discovered gravel cycling back in 2016 and made all the mistakes you don't need to make. I approach each episode as a beginner to unlock all the knowledge you need to become a great gravel cyclist. This week, I'm going to kick it back over to my co-host, Randall Jacobs, for a little something different for you. Randall's interviewing Sculptor, trail builder, and Mendocino cycling stalwart Nick Taylor in an exploration on how the bike became interwoven in one artist's life. Before I pass the mic over to Randall, I need to thank this week's sponsor, The Feed. The Feed is the largest online marketplace for sports nutrition. They've got all your favorite sports nutrition brands in one place. So if you've developed an affinity like I have for certain brands, you can hop on over to the Feed and mix and match so you get everything you need in one delivery. I was just visiting thefeed.com before recording this intro, and I remembered in addition to all the nutritional brands that they carry, they also carry a wide variety of training gear. You might remember a couple episodes back when we were focusing on recovery. We talked about foam rollers, we talked about Theraguns, we talked about pneumatic leg compression tools. I think we talked about the Power Dot. Actually, all these things are available at thefeed.com. So in addition to getting your nutrition handled, you can work on your recovery like I've been doing. And finally, I wanted to mention again the Feed formulas. The Feed formulas are the world's first daily supplement pouch for athletes, created in conjunction with Dr. Kevin Sprouse from the EF Pro Cycling team. They feature best-in-class branded supplements, never generics. You get personalized recommendation based on your needs as an athlete, and they're all delivered in a convenient daily pouch. We've got a limited time special offer of 50% off on your first order of the Feed formula by simply going to thefeed.com/thegravelride. Remember, that's thefeed.com/thegravelride. With that said, I'm going to hand it over to my co-host, Randall Jacobs, and his interview with Nick Taylor.
Nick, I've been looking forward to this conversation for some time. Welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me on, Randall.
So before we dive in, let's give listeners a bit of background. Who are you? Where are you from? What matters to you?
My name's Nick Taylor. I'm up here in Fort Bragg, California. That's about 180 miles north of San Francisco, along the coast, fairly remote area. I'm a sculptor and a big bicycle advocate, as well as running a trail crew, building trails out here in the Mendocino coast.
Yeah. And as somebody who has been to your workshop, I can say, well, one, the area is quite beautiful, and two, the space in which you create some of the things that we'll be talking about and linking to in the notes is a pretty special place. So tell us a bit about your relationship to the bicycle. How did it get started? How's it evolved over time?
Well, I think we all probably started riding bikes when we were kids, and I certainly did that on a gravel road in rural Ohio. So I had some experience as a kid. Then there was a big lapse, and it wasn't until I was in my early 20s that I picked the bicycle back up and started to use it again. And that was I don't know what the impetus was for getting back on a bike, but I wanted to do some exploring, and I guess that just seemed like a good way to go about it. And I bought myself an old Schwinn Latour for $80, and I was staying with my grandmother at that point up in Ohio, and I started doing some riding, and the rides, slowly became longer and longer, and I decided, well, you know what, I want to go do some touring, and so that led to a little bit of touring on that Latour prior to graduate school back in the early 80s.
So tell us about some of the early tours. What was that like?
Well, I was prepping to go to graduate school, and I really wanted to get out in between visiting one school and another. And I bought a Greyhound pass. It was good for 30 days, and pulled a map of the U.S. out and closed my eyes and put my finger down on wherever it came. And the first place was, I got out in Kadoka, South Dakota at midnight at a gas station. And, rode the next day through, from Kadoka through the Badlands and into Rapid City. And I didn't have a particularly good experience in Rapid City, so I pulled the map out again, closed my eyes, and fingered another place on the map and got out in Shelby, Montana. And I had a great time from there. So, I rode from Shelby across the Rocky Mountains and through Glacier National Park, which was just extraordinary. And then down to Spokane, Washington, at which point I had to crate my bike up and head to Davis, California to go look at the school there.
Oh, wow. So that was essentially coming off after a month of kind of dirt bagging, camping out, or what were your accommodations along the route?
Camping. I mean, everything I needed was on the bike.
So you found a shower before you had your interview?
Yeah. Knocked some of the stink off.
So now you're in Davis, and this is a program in what area?
So it was a MFA program for Master of Fine Arts, a graduate school. It was back in the early 80s, and I don't know where it is now, but it was a leading school for the arts. It rivaled Yale, their graduate department. And so I got there and they had a very open format, which I much enjoyed. Everything I was looking at on the East Coast was a very structured format. And I was done with that. I'd had 5 years of that at the University of Tennessee. And I was mostly just looking for studio time. And that's what I got in Davis. And I also got to be around people that were pretty well renowned, which was a new experience for me. I mean, I had people like Manuel Neary and Robert Arneson and Wayne Thiebaud and Roy DeForest were all teaching there. So I got exposure to all these professional artists that I hadn't experienced before.
And was the riding community as developed then as it is now? Right now, Davis is very much known as like having great bike infrastructure, and UC Davis has a top cycling team and so on.
It was definitely a big thing there. Bike culture was big in Davis, and that was a new thing too. I mean, most people, certainly all the students, and I think back then there were 16,000 students, they were getting around on bikes, and that was very cool. And there was a lot of road biking going on out there too, which I participated in. I got myself a Miata. I forget what model it was. It was their touring bike, which is a pretty nice bike. Though when I was buying it, it was the first new bike I'd ever had. And the guys kept telling me it was too big a frame. It's too big a frame. It's like I didn't listen to them. Should have, but I rode it for a number of years. It did me okay, but I realized in hindsight it was too big. From there, I moved to the East Bay and lived in Oakland and Point Richmond primarily. I mean, there were little stints in San Francisco and Berkeley, but primary residents were in Point Richmond and Oakland.
And what was it like back then versus what it's like at this time?
Well, there weren't as many people, and it was a little cheaper to live, and as an artist, you're always trying to live on the cheap, right? So, I mean, your goal is to be in your studio as much as you can and work as you have to cover your bills. So it was cheaper, it wasn't as affluent as it is now. Riding, was entirely different than it was in Davis. Everything out in Davis was flat land. The only thing you really had to contend with there was the wind, which could be quite daunting at times. Though anytime you had the wind to your back, if the conditions were just right, you'd be in this little envelope, this little bubble with the wind to your back, where there was absolutely no resistance. And it was a remarkable thing to experience because the only thing you would hear is the pedaling, the chain moving through the cranks and across the cassette. And other than that, and there was no resistance. It's just like you just flew across the landscape. And that was pretty extraordinary. You didn't get to experience that when you were in Oakland. I mean, you had the hills to contend with and climbing up to Skyline Drive and riding the ridge along through there, and certainly more traffic.
So I recall you mentioning like over a decade in the Bay Area?
20 years. Yeah, it was
20 years.
In the Bay Area for 20 years. It was a good experience. When I was in Point Richmond, we had a wonderful studio out there that was a live-work situation. It was an illegal live-in, but it was such a stunning location. I mean, you were a 7-acre parcel surrounded by a park on the San Francisco Bay that it was pretty extraordinary. It's just the kind of place you don't typically see in this day and age. Everything's been developed now.
Yeah. High-end condos and lofts.
Yeah. And so, we lived there. It was one of my last places to stay. And the property was sold. The park system bought the property that we were living in, and they wanted to incorporate it to the rest of the park. So we all got the boot and I didn't want to be a renter anymore. I wanted to buy something. So through a bit of searching, we found this place up here in Fort Bragg and made the move, even though we didn't know anybody up here.
And that was just a parcel of land at the time, right?
That's true. It was a small parcel, it's just over 2.5 acres, fully wooded, which is what I really wanted to avoid. I really wanted to buy something I could remodel and at least have utilities in, water and power, but we had nothing. It was a fully wooded property lot. And so Amy, my wife, and I, we spent a year of weekends coming up to the property from the Bay Area and logging the property ourselves. Cleared about 200 trees, and some of these are pretty good sized trees. And we did that with an old forklift that I bought and an old international harvester that I had with a big PTO winch on the front. So we spent a year of clearing the land. Then it went idle for a little bit, or the work went idle for a little bit as I was involved in a project down in the Bay Area that kept me tied up for a number of years.
Well, and that's not just any project. So maybe give listeners a little bit of a background on that, on what that project was and your involvement with it.
This was Cloud Gate. It's more commonly known as the Bean. It's a big piece of sculpture in the city of Chicago, which is now part of their landscape. It's an icon to the city. It's a 60-foot long, roughly 35-foot high, 45-foot wide, perfectly smooth mirror finish sculpture that's in the shape of a bean or something like a bean. And it's a pretty remarkable thing. So I was involved with that for 4.5 years. First working on the equipment we had to build for fabricating it, and then doing some of the prototyping, and then a lot of the fabrication of it, and then eventually back in Chicago for almost a year to see its installation and finish.
And for anyone who hasn't seen it, I strongly recommend that you look it up. For me, it's just this really surreal thing just plopped in this park in Chicago, reflecting the skyline. It almost looks like CGI because it's too perfect given the scale of the thing. And you and I have talked about the tolerances involved and so on. And like, think about just the weight of it and how that just wants to distort the structure and the material. What was your role specifically? You were the crew lead or the project lead?
On site, I would have been the supervisor overseeing all of its installation. And I was working in Chicago with the local Ironworkers 63, Local 63, which is a great group of fellows. I very much enjoyed working with them. And, the Bean was a prototype. It was like nobody had ever built anything like that. And it was a combination of old world, hands-on kind of technology and computer generated imagery. It's like you couldn't do it without being able to work with your hands, but you couldn't have done it without a computer because of all the tolerances that were involved. We had to have a computer set up, a piece of equipment that would scan each piece and make sure it was within tolerance of what the computer model was. And the tolerance for each piece is like a 32nd of an inch. So, and then you have 168 of those to put together, and the tolerances are no less stringent.
Well, and you have this thing that's mirror polished. So it doesn't just have to look good on its own. This mirror polish is going to reveal any sort of imperfection in the surface whatsoever and distort the image.
It absolutely does. And reflecting the skyline, the cityscape, with all the structures that are running plumb and horizontal, that grid work shows any sort of mistake in the reflection on the piece.
I hope to make it out there in person at some point before too long to check it out, but just seeing the imagery and some videos of it, it's quite an achievement. I mean, it's one thing to design such a thing and imagine such a thing, but there's so much about the execution of that is really a wonder. So well done there. And that's not the only large scale sculpture you've been involved with. That is probably pretty well known. There's another one that was outside the Mountain Bike Hall of Fame for some time. You want to talk about that and how that came about?
Sure. So that's still there. And that's something that sort of, back in 2011, up here on the coast, we were trying to put together a little fat tire festival to sort of open up the area to people from surrounding areas, let them know that we had some trail riding up here. There was some stuff happening in the way of mountain biking. And someone asked me to build some signage for this, to put out there to advertise this. And, I'm a sculptor, right? I don't do flat stuff. So I sort of scratched my head for a few days and wandered around the property and I realized I had these two big tractor tires sitting here off of a John Deere tractor. And I thought, you know what, I'll just make a big bike. I mean, that works as advertising as well as anything else. And at that point, I was riding Ibis Mojo, one of their carbon full suspension bikes. And I thought I'd just model the big one after that. So, I took a photo of the bike and put it on an opaque projector and projected it proper scale on the walls here, and did layout of the frame and transferred that to a piece of plywood and cut that out and started building to that frame and slowly went at it. So, and it was through working on this thing, that I got to know many of the people over at Ibis. And my wife, again, Amy, my wife, she contacted Scott Nickel and sent him some photos, which I knew he was like, great, I got some boneheads out here in the woods that think they're making sort of an Ibis bike, right? And because the photo shows two big tractor tires with a plywood cutout of the frame. And it's like, okay, what are these knuckleheads up to? But she continued to communicate with him and, send him photos as updates. And as I was nearing completion of this thing, he thought, okay, maybe this is actually going to turn out to be something kind of cool. And tail end of me working on and it's called Ibis Maximus. Tail end of working on Ibis Maximus, Scott asked me one day, it's like, so Nick, what's your day job that you're able to do this? And at that point, I just sent him a photo of the bean, and he's like, oh, okay, carry on. So anyhow, it was through making this big bike that I got to know Scott, and then many of the other partners down there in Ibis in Santa Cruz. So all of which are a great bunch of people. So I've been very fortunate to get to know them.
And how did it end up at the Mountain Bike Hall of Fame in is it Fairfax, California?
We were trying to figure out where to put it. It must have been Scott, because Ibis eventually bought it because it was sitting up here, not really doing anything. It was sort of lawn art. And I believe it was probably Scott that was looking to place it. And of course, he knows all the old guard down there in Fairfax. And Joe Breeze, who runs the place, I believe he mentored Scott for a little while early on. So they know one another. And so I think Scott set this up and then segued over to Joe Breeze.
So as somebody who runs a small bicycle brand, I can just say, like, what a coup that must be to actually have one of your bikes, especially something very iconic. Like, that's a very distinctive looking frame. If some bozo in the woods up in Mendocino County ever wants to make a giant version of one of our bikes, I'd be happy to oblige. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
Okay, I'll keep that in mind.
So, all right. So now you're in Mendocino. You've come back from doing the bean. You've cleared your land. What do you end up doing from there?
So back from Chicago, foundations in for the house by then. I mean, it'd been in maybe a couple of years by that point. Came back and started building our house and studio in earnest. And our house and studio are actually two old timber frame barns that we dismantled back in Ohio. They're 100 plus years old. They're all mortise and tenon, wooden pegs holding them together. Something we had gone back in 2000 and dismantled in Ohio.
And when you say we, you mean like you and your family, yeah?
Yeah, Amy and my kids, who were 12 and 14 at that point, and then Amy's parents and her brother came out for a week. And I had a good friend of mine that came out with his new girlfriend from Manhattan to give a hand for a week. And then I had a buddy that we paid to come out there for the 3 weeks that it actually took us to dismantle this. So that was a great project. We had a lot of fun. And for my kids, it was the first time for them being back in the Midwest. And it's sort of familiar stomping grounds to me. I'm not from that particular area where we dismantled the barns, but I am from Northeast Ohio, and lightning bugs are all familiar. My kids got to see that sort of stuff, and they got to play with fireworks for the first time.
And again, the space up there is one of the more special spaces I've ever visited. You had me up there, I think 3-4 years ago. And the home is beautiful. And that's one of the barns, right? And then the back section, the workshop, it makes me think of Craig Calfee's shop south of Santa Cruz, or in the Santa Cruz area. It's another one of these places where you just have tools and projects everywhere. And it has a certain degree of organization, but a sufficient amount of chaos. And you can tell it's like a place where a lot of experimentation happens, a lot of creativity happens. And just the number of specialized tools that you have, many of which you've made, it's really, really cool to see. And you occasionally hold exhibits up there too, right?
Open studio from time to time. I'm hoping to do that again this year. If COVID actually is settling down, you can open the place back up again. So got lots of new work going on, and it's good to invite people in, let them see the work that I'm working on, but also let them see the space that it's actually created in too. Because I think that puts a different spin on things and gives people a little more insight to what's going on.
Yeah. And in fact, you have a video on your website. Remind me the URL for your website.
So website is jnicktaylor.com. Instagram is a good place to see what's current, and it's the same jnicktaylor.
Well, the website does have this really nice video that shows you in your studio working on some of your pieces, and then there's a number of your pieces put on a pan so that you can get a 3D view of it. And you work in different various materials, metal and wood. You work on things that can fit. What are your smaller pieces and what are your bigger pieces? And let's you do that. Talk a bit about like the type of work that you do and the inspiration for it.
So I'm working in metal or wood. I rarely combine the two materials. So my studio is kind of divided up in half. One end I'm doing metal work on, the other end I'm doing woodwork in. All the pieces these days are pretty much inspired by nature, my outdoor environment. They don't necessarily make reference to any one given thing, but probably a lot of different elements of what one might experience if they were out in nature. So the work is pretty organic. The metalwork, I'm doing a lot of welding, forging, grinding to get the shapes. Their scale can range anywhere from about 2 feet in height to, I'm working on something right now, it's about 7 feet. So some stuff's tabletop in size, so other pieces are certainly floor standing pieces. Larger, the largest wood pieces. I mean, the wood pieces all tend to be a little larger. They stand, maybe 4 feet up to about 9 feet. They also are very organic, but some of them are carved from single pieces of wood, and other pieces are a composite of pieces that are glued up and then carved back into. So all of them are very hands-on, very labor intensive. I'm getting 3 to 4 pieces done a year. A larger piece, whether it be metal or wood, can take me 10 months to a year alone to work on. So a lot of handwork, and I just haven't figured out a way to expedite that. I keep trying to figure out ways to move faster, but it always seems to come back to handwork.
Well, and just looking on, at some of the imagery, I've seen a few of these pieces in person, and there are pieces that are very clearly flowing with the contours of the wood that you're working with. But then there's also some vision that's imposed on it to some degree as well. Some of your metal work, there's pieces that for me look like contorted musical instruments, and every angle tells a different story and evokes a different, set of feelings and images. It's very abstract and very interesting. Looking at your work, it really draws one in to explore it from different angles.
And that's really important. When I was a kid and in art school, one of the things that was hammered into me was any given piece of sculpture should invite you to walk all the way around it and explore it. You shouldn't be able to stand on one side of it and know what's happening on the other side. So it should shift and change and draw you in and draw you around the given piece.
So let's bring the bike back into the conversation. Mm-hmm. How does the bike fit into your process or your day-to-day or week-to-week routine?
So these days, I'm fortunate enough to be in the studio 4 days a week, full time, uninterrupted. But I can only be in the studio for those 4 days, and then I'm like maxed out. I can't put any more time in. I've got to put my head in a different space. And so I spend 2 days on the bike out in the woods. So here in Fort Bragg, Mendocino area, we've got a really nice trail system, and then we also have unlimited number of gravel roads. I mean, much of our mountain biking is in Jackson Demonstration State Forest. If I'm not mistaken, they have a minimum of 300 miles of gravel road in there, right? And then there are all these entities that butt up against Jackson Demonstration State Forest. I mean, you have Big River State Park, you've got Conservation Fund, and then north of Jackson, you have Lime Timber. Now, lime timber and conservation fund land, you have to have permission to be on their property. But I think conservation fund certainly gives that pretty readily. And I've never heard of anybody having an issue on lime timber. And lime timber is 150,000 acres, right? Jackson Demonstration State Forest is just under 50,000 acres. Big River State Park is like 7,500 acres. And conservation fund, I may be mistaken, but I think they're 30 to 40,000 acres. And all of these places have gravel roads running around on them, right? I'm sure you could chain this stuff all together and get up into Usall, which is about an hour north of here. And you've got unlimited resource up there for riding gravel roads as well.
And you're involved in a lot of the trail building up there as well.
That's my other form of sculpting the landscape. Since I've been a little kid, and working outdoors, it's part of my core. It's part of what I really love doing. So it's like, I run a trail crew up here, and we're maintaining and building trails in Jackson Demonstration State Forest. And we're doing that in conjunction with CAL FIRE. And CAL FIRE are the stewards, the managers of the forest. So we've got a 10-year relationship that we've developed with them, and it's going strong. We've currently got some projects going. Everything these days is being hand dug. Though 2 years ago, we had a new experience with getting some trails machine built. We got a 2.25 mile trail machine built that we were able to lay out, and through a sponsor, One Track Mind, better known as OTM, who funded it, we were able to build this new trail that connected a bunch of other stuff together and made for a better trail system.
So for listeners who want to explore this area, want to learn more about it and get a toe in the water, what resources are available, what clubs are available to get a handle on what you're describing, which is this massive amount of space that you could very easily get lost in and not necessarily find the best trails?
So the trail work that I'm doing is under or with Mendocino Coast Cyclists. We're the local cycle group. I can be contacted through them, or the club president, Dan Sweet, could be contacted, and we can set you up. We can be found on Facebook under Mendocino Coast Cyclists. That's probably the easiest way. I'm sort of thinking this through. I'm thinking aloud. And we have group rides. So that have been closed during COVID, but I think they're beginning to open those back up. And people can join these group rides. And they typically are happening 3 times a week, Tuesdays, Fridays, and Sundays. But we also, as a listserv, if you're a club member, this is probably the best way to get any sort of information, is if you join the club, you can get on a listserv and you can get all the chatter that's going on, and you get notifications of rides. You can ask questions if you're trying to find your way around for the first time.
Very cool. So before we finish up, you've mentioned your wife, Amy, and, sounds like a pretty extraordinary woman to have supported everything from buying of a plot of land in the middle of nowhere. Well, not the middle of nowhere, in a very beautiful area, but a good distance from the city, to going out with you and the kids and tearing down some barns and so on. Tell us about that dynamic.
Well, Amy's a pretty extraordinary person, and she's been game to go on a lot of adventures, and they're adventures that we've developed together. She's a brilliant person. She's very capable. She tolerates me. She has her own business, land use permit agent up here on the coast. She's the go-to person if you want to develop anything in the coastal zone.
Clearly cares about the work that you do, and doing things like reaching out to people like Scott Nichols over at IBIS to get attention on your projects and so on.
Yeah.
Well, is there anything else that you'd like to discuss while we're on the pod today?
I think that pretty well does it. I mean, please visit the website and Instagram and let me know what you think. And if you happen to be up this way in Mendocino, Fort Bragg area, give a shout. So we love showing people around, and the riding up here is pretty extraordinary. And if you want to, if you like being out in the woods, doing mountain biking, you can go for all day rides and not see anybody up here at all. If you're riding during the week, which is pretty extraordinary to have the woods to yourself.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. Well, we will be sure to get some links in the show notes for this episode for anyone looking to connect with you or to learn more about the Mendocino Trail Network. Nick, it's been great catching up with you. It's been some time. And as I mentioned, had been looking forward to it for quite a while, and really appreciate you joining us.
Well, thank you very much for having me on, Randall. And this is really nice, and it's good to spend a little time with you as well. I don't see you often enough these days.
We'll try to rectify that later on this year. I'll make a trip up the coast.
Alrighty. You take care, man.
Be well. Be well.
That's going to do it for this week's edition of the Gravel Ride podcast. Thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoyed that interview between Randall and Nick Taylor. Be sure to check out Nick's extraordinary work at jnicktaylor.com or on Instagram at jnicktaylor. We'll have links for these as well as the Ibis Maximus and Cloudgate in the show notes. If you're interested in connecting with myself or Randall, please visit us at theridership.com. That's www.theridership.com. Join our global cycling community. Everything's free, and I'm sure you'll get a lot out of the interactions with your fellow gravel athletes and also your hosts here at the Gravel Ride podcast. If you're interested in supporting the podcast, you can visit us at buymeacoffee.com/thegravelride. Additionally, ratings and reviews are hugely helpful. And with that, until next time, here's to finding some dirt under your wheels.